Salam, and welcome to the Logic of the Birds podcast. With me today to discuss the poetry of Sana'i, I have Professor Parisa Zahiremami from King's College and Professor Nicholas Boylston from Seattle University. Professor Zahiremami, please, could you tell us a little bit about your relationship to this poet? What first got you interested in Sana'i's poetry, and what have you come to appreciate about it over time?
Sure. Well, hello. Thank you so much for giving me this fabulous opportunity. I am a scholar of Islamic mysticism working on the intersection of poetry, mysticism, and politics. And Sana'i has all of these. So I came across Sana'i as a child, of course, being born and raised in Iran. He's always part of the school curriculum. And I always loved his poetry. But I was a PhD student at the University of Toronto, and I was working for a course on a commentary of the Quran by a Timurid scholar and Quran exegete and prose stylist, Hussein Vaez Kashefi. And I saw that Sana'i is quoted there, and I was like, wow, look at that. Sana'i is quoted in this Quran commentary. And of course, we know that Sana'i is quoted very widely. He's quoted by Attar, he's quoted by Rumi, by a lot of, authors, but a handful of scholars have really worked on him. Then I came across some illustrated manuscripts that were produced in the Safavid court. And I was like, why is Sana'i so big in the Safavid period? Was there any political motive for promoting Sana'i? I mean, the Safavids promoted Shahnameh quite a lot, but there was a political agenda there. So I was wondering what the political agenda is. And that got me interested in Sana'i to see what the politics of his poetry is. And so that's how I started working on Sana'i, and it seems for the next decade of my life, I will be working on him because I'm working on his reception history right now.
Wonderful. Wonderful. Thank you. Professor Boylston, I mean, Sana'i is not as well known as Rumi or Hafez or these other Persian poets. How did you first come across his poetry, and what drew you to it?
Yeah, thanks so much for inviting me to be here. It's really fantastic to get a chance to discuss these things with you. So I think like a lot of people, I got to Persian poetry through Maulana Jalaluddin Rumi. It's such a figure who speaks to everybody's heart. But when I got to working and doing research on this, he was just so vast. Like Rumi is the Bahr Ma'rifat. He's the ocean of gnosis. You enter that ocean, you never come out. So I wanted to develop some skills to be able to, first to read Rumi better. So I asked myself what's going on in the century before Rumi. And these big influences, as Dr. Zahiremami mentioned, Sana'i and Attar was so important. So I've been looking at the century before Rumi and the things happening in poetry and also prose in the 12th century CE. And Sana'i is such a central figure in that. And then when I heard his poetry, one of these poems I'll read today, I was just floored by the beauty of it, the power of his language, and then the power of the message as well. So it's that power of the message and the power of the language really combined in many of his mystical poems.
That's great. So you mentioned his 12th century CE. Can you give us a little bit more context for Sana'i? Who was he? Where did he live? What did he do for a living? What's going on in his context?
Yeah, he's got a really interesting life. And the interesting thing is a lot of myths grew up around Sana'i. And the myths grew up because of people were looking at his works, and they have so many different types of poems. And a lot of the poems, it's court poetry. It's praising the men of power of his day. And also these love poems, which are very, very sensual. But then you have very mystical stuff in there as well. So the story came about, it was kind of invented after Sana'i that he was this court poet and was making money through poetry. And then this Qalandari, this antinomian wine drinker comes and says, you're a complete hypocrite why are you doing all this for the sake of the world? You need to wake up. And then, so the myth goes that Sana'i heard this and then wakes up and then becomes this kind of mystical figure. It turns out not to be true. So that was created to explain why there's so many contradictions. But he starts out, he's born in the mid-11th century and he's trained as a young poet in the Ghaznavid court. So it's the legacy of basically one of the centers of classical Persian poetry. These court poets of the Ghaznavid period have been the really great court poets, and they've refined the style to really refined levels in terms of metaphor, in terms of linguistic usage, but for the sake of courtly ends. Again, a lot of praise poetry and that kind of thing. So he's trained in that, and then he's not that successful. He leaves. He goes from Ghazna to Balkh, and he writes this text called the Karname of Balkh, like the resume of Balkh, where he's basically dissing all the people back in Ghazna and talking about the terrible cult politics there and things like that. And then he finds fame as a religious poet, and he's writing poems for the sessions of sermonizing. We think of sermons in the Islamic tradition about the Friday sermon and the Friday prayer, but actually in this time in a lot of the medieval world, the sermons would be a public event. Many times a week, they would hold these sermons. It would be a place people came to socialize. It would be a place with a political significance. And the core of it would be a sermon telling people to be more pious. So if you've got a really good poet next to you while you're giving these sermons, you can have a really big impact. So Sana'i gained his fame for those sessions of sermonizing, writing poems, telling people you need to be more pious. But then we realize he's doing really amazing, inventive things with that. So he travels around Khorasan. He meets a patron called Muhammad ibn Mansur, who's the chief qadi of Sarakhs. He's a Hanafi legal scholar, but I think he's Sana'i's mystical guide for a number of reasons. And he writes a lot of poems for him. And then eventually he returns back to Ghazna, triumphant. Now he's this famous poet. And everyone wants him to be the court poet. Now Sultan Bahram Shah asks him to be the court poet. He says no, but he writes his Hadiqat, the World Garden of Truth, as his kind of final masterpiece. So it's the old story of you leave the home in search of something, and then eventually you come back having found what you were looking for in a kind of mythic archetype.
Oh, wonderful. So it's not so much a case of there being, well, maybe there are contradictions in there's an early Sana'i who's writing all this court and sensual stuff. Then he gets out of town, makes his fame and his name as this kind of in these preaching sessions, and starts writing mystical poetry in that, and then comes back. So is he still, is there, because with other Persian poets, there's not the sensual is the spiritual is the sensual. Is that the case with Sana'i, or is there an early Sana'i who's all about the lips and the cups and the, and the power and the gold, and then a later Sana'i who's kind of about more mystical, spiritual, moralizing things, or is it more complex than that?
Yeah, so I think he keeps writing the sensual stuff to the end of his life. He keeps praising men of power to the end of his life, but he brings in that tension and that contradiction. And for me, in many ways, Sana'i is the beginning. Strangely, it's the 12th century, late 11th, early 12th century, but he's got the first collection of ghazals in the Persian tradition. First significant collection of the love poems is Sana'i. The first didactic masnavi, a Sufi mystical long poem in rhymed couplets, is Sana'i's Walled Garden. He's got an important collection of the qasidas, or the homiletic odes, that defines the tradition as well. So he actually establishes the trends for the next 800 years. And I see that about this tension, because he has that courtly basis, but he has those mystical interests as well. So he keeps doing both. And so all of that tension in Persian classical poetry, I find you can find that in Sana'i's life. Almost as if he's the fountainhead of this entire tradition that has this tension between the worldly and the spiritual, because he kept that courtly form with all its worldly dimensions. And then he's going to the poetry of the Sufi Khaniqahs, and he's bringing in the mystical poetry into these refined forms and kind of pouring it into those really refined poetic forms. So that tension that results from that, for me, it's actually reflective of the life of one individual, which is Sana'i himself. So he's so important in this tradition because he sets the stage of all of that ambiguity. You don't know. is this the early Sana'i and he's just talking about a beautiful lady or a beautiful boy or something like that? Or is this the later Sana'i where he's just talking about spiritual things? Or maybe he doesn't see any tension between the two, and he talks about the fact that you can't look directly at the sun. If you want to see the sun, you have to see it reflected in a pool of water. So physical human beauty is a way of contemplating the divine as well. All of those contradictions are right there in Sana'i.
That's fascinating. Professor Zahiremami, do you have anything to add to that? What are these courts that he's involved in? What are they like? And what are these Sufi Khanaqah spaces that he's involved in? And is the Persian language itself is in this form, it's relatively new, right? It's a few centuries old at this point.
Right, like Farsi, the new Persian is a few centuries old at that point. So Dr. Boylston pretty much said everything. What I want to add is that that's true. Like he keeps doing both even till the end of his life. I mean, the last complete work of his, like the last kind of big work of his, is his magnum opus, The Walled Garden, right? Which is a didactic Sufi long poem in couplets. And in that, you see a lot of themes that he's grabbing from Mirrors for Princes and manuals of political advice. And then he's like combining those with completely mystical concepts, such as walayat, the sanctified authority. But then his sanctified authority is like a mixture of, like, let's say, as-sultan dhillullah ta'ala fil ard, which means the king is the shadow of God on earth, but also it has a mystical tinge to it because the shadow of God in his poetry is like the manifestation of God. And so a lot of advice that he gives to his royal patron, Bahram Shah, and Bahram Shah is a Ghaznavid ruler, who was ruling parts of like the eastern parts of the Islamic world, so Khorasan, Transoxiana, parts of like the northern part of the subcontinent. And he ruled there from 1117 to 1157. At the time that he's ruling, he's actually the vassals of the Seljuk, another dynasty that had kind of come into Persia. And so the Ghaznavi territory is shrinking. At the same time, he's having a rivalry with the Ghurids, another dynasty that were originally the vassals of the Ghaznavids, but now because of the rivalry between Seljuks and Ghaznavids, they're expanding their territory as well. So he's dealing with a lot of problems, and having a court poet as strong as Sana'i, who's quite entrenched in all sorts of traditions, could give him a lot of propaganda leverage, right? And so you would see how Sana'i preaches this ruler and preaches mystical advice, but also kind of weaves politics into that to aggrandize and celebrate his royal patron, right? But of course, his poetry was read in sermons, like during his travel before he ended up in the court of Ghazna and served Bahram Shah. He was, of course, he doesn't become an official court poet, as Dr. Boylston said, and there's politics behind that as well. But he's going around, and at some point in Herat, he becomes part of this group of cleric Sufis, and the head of that group is the son of the very renowned Sufi Khaja Abdullah Ansari. And so his poetry is actually recited in their sermons. And the fact that he's kind of going around and exposing himself to all sorts of different patrons, army generals, sometimes Shiite patrons, Sufis, this kind of helps him intellectually like grab themes from all sorts of like themes that are closer to the heart of all these different social groups, and then weave them together in his poetry.
Fantastic. Yeah, the poet kind of has to be a magpie and collect things from everywhere and pull them together in this synthetic way. Now that we have a bit of his context, let's dive into some of his poetry. Professor Boylston, could you share with us or give us some examples of some poems or verses of Sana'i's that are the most famous or most celebrated, or even just your favorite, and tell us why they're so celebrated or why they're your favorite.
I'd be happy to. So this poem, this is a selected translation. The poem itself is over 100 lines long. So I've just chosen some key lines from the beginning of the poem. And it's one of these poems that would have been recited in these sessions of sermonizing. It's telling people to be more pious, but it's really going to a really high level of mystical insight. So I'll just read one line of the Persian so you can just hear what it sounds like. Makon dar jism o jan manzil ke in dunast o an vala. Qadam zin har do birun ne, na inja bash o na anja. Make not your home in body nor soul, for one's lofty, the other low. Take but one step beyond these two, so be not here and be not there. Of that which leads you from the way, be it infidelity or faith. Of that which keeps you from the friend, what matter if it's fair or foul? The wayfarer's sole proof is this: he comes from hell, you find him cold. The lover's sign is none but this, though from the sea you find him dry. Speech spoken for religion's sake, be it Syriac, be it Hebrew. Location sought out for the truth, be it utter east, be it utter west. When no has cast you from the bounds of humanity to bewilderment, then from the light of divinity you come to God through accept. Why do you halt for carrion's sake, like the crows in this baseness? Like the peacocks break your cage, fly up at once up to these heights. So die, O friend, before your death, if you are in search of life. For from such death did Hermes come to be of paradise before. May you be slain by the blade of love, that you may find eternal life. For from the sword of Azrael shall not be left a living trace.
Wonderful. And this is your own translation?
Yeah.
It's beautifully translated as well, too. Thank you very much. So this is a masnavi then? These are rhyming couplets?
This is qasideh. So it always ends in the rhyme ah. It has an ah sound at the end, which allows him to do a lot of things. He uses the shahada la ilaha illallah, there's no God but God. He uses the word illa a lot at the end, and he loves doing this. So that's the line when Noah's cast you from the bounds. It's la, no God. Then you come to divinity, you come to God through accept. So that's one of his favorite kind of images. He uses that a lot. So he's playing on the Islamic context. Sometimes he'll play even on the way the word is written, because la is sometimes written like a mouth. He'll say it's the crocodile's mouth going to swallow up all of existence. He's giving you really high kind of mystical ideas. There's the idea here of die before death. Prophet Muhammad said, die before you die. And if you die before you die, you don't die when you die. So die, O friend, before your death if you're in search of life. He's playing on all of these religious themes that the audience would have been familiar with. But of course, reading them in a deeply, deeply mystical way as these things were read in that context and have been read since.
Yeah, I mean, I almost feel bad asking this because it's for me, it's apparently very, very interesting. What makes this great? There's all this incredible imagery. It's in the qasideh form, so there's the mono rhyme there. The rhythm is very strong as well. You can see how this, would lend itself well to oral performance. In your opinion, what attracted you to this poem, and what does the tradition find really excellent about this poem?
So this genre of the homiletic qasida, it's one of those things where to have an impact, it needs to be just right. And contemporary scholar Muhammad Reza Shafi'i Kadkani, who's really one of the most important Iranian critics of Persian poetry, he basically says Sana'i sets the standard and nobody reaches that point until you get a completely new wave in the 20th century, 19th and 20th century. So there's something often quite stately about Sana'i's language. It's not frantic usually like Rumi. It's not got the kind of mellifluousness of a Sa'di or a Hafez, but it's very stately and it's got a kind of extremely measured quality, but that gives it a power. It's as if what he's writing is written in stone. That's the way it should be said. Anyone after Sana'i, you can hear if they sound like Sana'i, because he's got this particular way of saying it. And then that first line is what caught me. Make not your home in body nor soul. So you find many people saying transcend the body. Many people say transcend the body. Who tells you transcend the soul? or the word is Jan, which means spirit, soul, life. And that's pure non-duality. That's pure non-duality. It's one thing to transcend the body and be in the kind of the realm of the spirit, but to transcend that as well is to go to pure tawheed and pure unity, which is, of course, the core doctrine of the Islamic tradition. And he keeps coming back to that. So transcending infidelity and faith, If faith stops you reaching the beloved, let it go. If infidelity gets you to the beloved, that's where you need to be. So transcending those dualities. And again, you could hear in those lines the playing with paradox, which is obviously a common mystical theme, but he does it so beautifully in the line. Really, when he hits that line, it sticks in your mind. It's like it's the perfect expression of that. And also, because I've been looking at religious pluralism, he says speech spoken for religious sake, let it be Syriac, let it be Hebrew as well. So he's very complex on this theme. There's not just one way he approaches the theme of religious diversity, but there is this idea, what's really important is the truth, and the formal expression is not what it's about, even though his formal expression is so beautiful.
Yeah, I was struck when you were reading the translation. It's kind of deceptively simple because you can hear it and read it and say the words, and even in the English translation, but it flows and it's relatively simple to read, but you probably take a few lifetimes to understand everything that's going on there. And it's sincere, but it's not corny. And I think this is the thing with homiletic poetry and preaching and addresses. It's really easy to be corny. At least this poem of Sana'i's anyway. This certainly doesn't strike me as corny.
That's right. No, this is precisely a classic because it's so pithy, it's so rich, and then again, once he's said it, it's as if everybody knows that was the way it was supposed to be said, but again, without being corny. So the people who follow him in this genre kind of find it hard to really break out of that in many ways. Yeah, no, it's tough. It's tough to imagine improving upon that. Professor Zahiremami, do you have any favorite verses or particularly celebrated poems of Sana'i's you'd like to share with us and help us understand why they're so celebrated?
So since Dr. Boylston picked a qasida, I'm going to pick part of an anecdote from his wall garden, which is in written in couplets. So I read a few verses of the Persian and then I'll translate it for you. It's a relatively long anecdote, so I'm just going to read selected verses. بود شهری بزرگ در حد غور و در آن شهر مردمان همه کور. پادشاهی در آن مکان بگذشت، لشکر آورد و خیمه زد بر دشت. داشت پیلی بزرگ با هیبت، از پی جاه و حشمت و سولت. The poem goes as follows. There was a big city in the borders of Ghur. And so remember that I said Ghurids are a dynasty that have rivalry with the Ghaznavids. And in that city, all the people were blind. A king passed by that place. He brought his army and established his tents on the meadow there. He had a large, awesome elephant as a result of his rank, grandeur, and awe. So elephants were supposed to be royal animals, and they were actually used in the Ghaznavid army to cast fear in the hearts of the enemies in the battlefield. Due to such an awe, people desired to see the elephant. Some men from among the blind came to the elephant, some among those naked ones. And so he's now calling those blind people naked ones, kind of like in a derogatory where he's kind of making fun of them, like they're kind of backward people. By means of touching one part, found out about that part. So each of these blind people come and touch a part of that elephant, and then they guess. One person touches the legs, they would say, oh, this is, a column. So on and so forth. When one touches the back, and then it's a throne, right? So none of them understand the elephant as a whole, right? And Sana'i uses this anecdote at the end. He actually comes to conclusion to say that this elephant is like a symbol of God, and nobody knows God as a whole. Nobody can fully understand the unity of God. So this is just a very like a simple anecdote. The language is not very complex. It's just a story easily read. But then there is this mystical message behind it. Interestingly, however, what makes me interested in this anecdote, and it's actually one of the most celebrated anecdotes, it's also one of the anecdotes that are oftentimes like included in illustrated manuscripts, and there is an illustration accompanying it. But what makes me interested in this is that it happens in Ghur, and the people of Ghur are blind. And so in the context of the rivalry between the Ghaznavids and the Ghurids, this could be a mockery of the Ghurids. And interestingly, this king that has this elephant is at the borders of Ghur, right? And is kind of establishing his tents. And we know that Sana'i's royal patron Bahram Shah had overseen multiple campaigns at the border of Ghur. So this could be like an allusion to Bahram Shah. And the fact that this elephant is standing for God in this anecdote, it can stand for divine charisma of this ruler, this charismatic ruler that has this divine charisma here, the elephant. And the fact that Ghurids cannot figure out what this animal is means that they're blind to the truth and they can't understand the legitimacy of the rule of Bahram Shah. So like the anecdote has like kind of double meaning. It has a completely political meaning, but at the same time, a mystical meaning. His walled garden is full of these like kind of clever anecdotes that have double meanings.
Yeah, they cut both ways. I mean, is this story from Sana'i? Because this was in a kid's book I had growing up, the seven blind mice and the elephant. I mean, is Sana'i pulling this story from somewhere else, or is this?
Yes, he is.
All right.
He is. I'm glad you asked this. So this is originally, and this anecdote has an Indian origin. It's cited in Buddhist texts, Hindu texts, and also Jain texts. And in the context of the Ghaznavid period, this is very important because there's quite a lot of Indian influences on Ghaznavid poets. But before Sana'i, multiple Sufi and philosopher authors have had used this. Al-Ghazali is one of them, right? And so they comment on it. Each of them have their own rendition of it. And then Rumi also has it. Rumi takes it to a whole different level. His people are not blind men here. They actually are fine. They can see, but the elephant is in the dark. And he says that if each of them had a lamp in the palm of their hands, they could have seen this, and that lamp could stand for the guide, right? The spiritual guide. So, but in here, Sana'i is just talking, but kind of sticking to the original story, and is just using it to say God is kind of beyond our understanding.
Right. And so the form of this poem in this case is from the longer Masnavi,
yes,
the couplets.
The couplets
form.
Yeah.
Do we have any ghazals that you could share? Oh, Professor Boylston. All right. Let's hear a ghazal, and please help us understand what makes this one so awesome. Thank you.
So I've been thinking a lot about this context of the sessions of sermonizing, and Sana'i does a lot of social critique and things like that as well. So he has this really famous poem, Musalmanan, Musalmanan, Musalmani, Musalmani, which basically means, oh Muslims, be Muslim, be Muslim. So he's really criticizing the hypocrisy of his day. But then also he'll play, you see already how many different levels he's playing with in all his poetry at the same time. So this is a ghazal that starts a Musalmanan. So you think it's one of these homiletic poems telling people, to shape up and be better and things like that. But he says, ای مسلمانان مرا در عشق آن بت غیرت است عشق بازی نیست که این خود حیرت اندر حیرت است. O Muslims, of that idol's love I am protective jealously, for this is not a play of love but perplexity in perplexity. For love is a surrounding sea, its water nothing is save fire, and like a range of darkened mounts the waves are crashing in. Amidst those swirling ocean depths 300 sharks do lie in wait, and on the shores are standing there 100 dragons, fearsome fell. The boat is made of sorrowers, The anchor is from patience wrought. The sails are set towards the wind, yet tribulation's wind it is. And I am cast, without myself, within this deep and darkened sea, just like a freeman who has donned the clothes and yoke of servitude. For I was dead, and then I drowned, and wonder then I came to life. A jewel now has come to hand that's worthy of the 2 worlds' price.
Wow. My goodness. What a beautiful translation as well, too. That's outstanding. So what's going on in this? So this is a ghazal, meaning it has the standard end rhyme and then the radif, the repeated phrase at the end.
And it has to, ghazal basically has to be about love. But within that format, you can do anything. So this is obviously such a visual one. We think this one influenced a lot of people afterwards. Attar has a kind of version of this, and others do as well. And he's obviously playing on the same theme in the other poem I read, that you die before you die, right? But emphasizing the power of love, and it's not just a romantic love this time. This is pure mystical love and bewilderment it's the mysterium tremendum, coming face to face with the grandeur of the power of love. And also Persian poetry, so often love it's awesome and terrible and extremely painful at the same time. So he brings all that to bear, but through very kind of visual images of the sea and the boat, and getting cast into the sea, and then of course there's a slight image of pearl diving as well. Of you go into the sea and you come back with the jewel that's priceless, where you have to be ready to sacrifice your own life in order to get there. So, but I really like the bait and switch with this one. And it's things, Rumi will use this later. Oh, Muslims, I know not who I am, right? You say to the Muslims as if you're going to tell them what to do, and then you're like, I'm completely bewildered. So it's playing on the homiletic mood of I'm going to be the preacher and tell you what to do, and then it's turning around and saying, but I'm completely bewildered and perplexed myself. So I really love that move.
Well, not just bewildered and perplexed, but I'm in love with an idol, right? So he's saying like, oh, Muslims, right? Like, tap on the microphone, preaching time. Let me tell you about this idol I'm in love with. What's going on there? What's Mr. Preacher Man doing, talking about love for an idol? And
there's 2 ways of reading that. One way is just to say that the word but, which comes from the word Buddha, actually, it comes from the Buddhist statues probably, and also Sanam. One way is to say that it just come to stand in for the beloved, like American Idol, that kind of idol. But another way to read it is Sana'i has a genre called the Qalandariyat or Kharabati ghazals, where you go to the outskirts of town where there's this ruins, and it's this mix of a casino, a tavern, and a brothel, and all the kind of forbidden stuff happens there. And always in those poems, the beloved is called the idol. This is one of the things he does, is he brings you to a perspective that is completely non-conventional. I call it the impossible perspective. It's what proves that you have to transcend unity by getting to that point of something that's completely forbidden. So this ghazal doesn't completely fit into that genre, but again, with Sana'i has written so much of this kind of stuff that you can definitely read it there. And ultimately, it's about transcending duality, I would say, and also being able to see the inner qualities behind outward appearance. So very much in Sana'i's worldview, and then all of the Persian poets afterwards, you can't judge someone based on appearance. Often there'll be stories where the person serving wine in this tavern, he turns out to be the most holy of all the people. And he's so holy that he can go and serve people that society has rejected. So Sana'i is definitely, again, one of the people who laid a lot of the conventions of that genre, which also took off as one of the key genres, and you find it in so many other poets as well.
You're going to hate me for this, but as we were talking, I was thinking this whole genre, it's like Sana'i saying, I like big boots, and I cannot lie. he's got his love of the boots there. All right. Okay, moving on then. I mean, you've already both touched on this, but Professor Zahiremami, can you tell us some more about what are some of the main concepts, themes, or motifs that show up across Sana'i. It sounds like there's a really vast of, but if you can, walk us through some of the main concepts or themes or motifs or features across his work.
For sure. So one of the main themes that appear both in his qasidas and his walled garden as well, so his mystical advice, is transcendence and beyond the realm of soul and also beyond universal intellect. So I'll have to explain a little bit where he's coming from with this. So he very much has a new Platonic framework for this. In New Platonism, the word is created as a series of emanations, right? So the one which later then gets translated in monotheistic religions as God is up there. And then after that, there is the universal intellect. It's like the world intellect. And then that creates the soul, and then the soul, from the soul, the matter. And then we're at the bottom in the material world, and we have to make our way up to unite with God. So that means we'll have to go beyond the soul, beyond the intellect to reach God, right? And so that very much appears in a number of his poems. Even the poems, even the qasidas that are panegyrics to Bahram Shah, you would wonder like why he should do that, because it's a panegyric poem. He should just just praise Bahram Shah, but he praises Bahram Shah in mystical terms as somebody who has kind of gone beyond the realm of intellect and soul. I've just brought some examples here. There's this qasida where he says, the universal intellect remained astounded by the form of my beloved's countenance. So the beloved's countenance is just kind of something beyond the universal intellect. That's
quite a pickup line.
Yeah, I mean, he kind of starts
universal
like
intellect
that.
is bewildered. That's where he starts. Is bewildered by the beauty of your countenance.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And then you would wonder, like, it's like the beloved, and you wouldn't think, that this beloved is Bahram Shah. You keep going and going, and so qasidas have this part called the tashbib, which is like, or taghazzul, which is the part that's like the ghazal. So it's oftentimes either the description of nature or it's love, right? And then the madih comes, which is the actual praise. And when he kind of switches to the praise, you're like, okay, this was for Bahram Shah, right? And so it's very interesting, like how the first part of this qasida kind of plays with the madih part. But then he goes on to say the soul repented from being the soul, or the soul basically gave up its life force and decided to stay with the beloved. Then he goes on and says the soul's accidental soul, meaning accidental life, faded, and its immortal soul remains. So even the soul has gone through that transcendence. And then he says, before his countenance is the beloved countenance. The morning laughed at the firmament sun. The true light remained laughing without lips and teeth. And you would wonder what happened in this verse. And the verse has a lot of intricate imagery. So he's basically saying that so he says this laughter of the morning is like different from the divine, the true light, which is the divine light, which has basically no lips or teeth. And it is actually the beloved that has that sort of a divine laughter or has this sort of a divine light. So again, you're kind of dealing with all this kind of poetic, intricate imagery to explain this ruler that's kind of transcended above the soul, the intellect. He's beyond the light that we see in the morning. And then he says, before his countenance, the form giver, the intellect, and the soul were again bewildered. Like fortune, love sat before him without any concern. Like faith, infidelity remained naked before him. So not only he understands faith, also he sees through infidelity. So he has this kind of like piercing knowledge. Infidelity and faith are among the marks of his locks and countenance. For this reason, the mark of day and night, that is light and darkness, remained in infidelity and faith. So infidelity is dark like the night, faith is bright like the morning, and all of these are sourced by him. They're coming from him as if he's this kind of, omnipotent, transcendent ruler that's beyond everything and is the source of everything like God is. So you see like even his panegyrics are very much, you see the concept of soul and intellect and going beyond that kind of appearing in his panegyrics as well and in his portrayal of his patron. And so that's definitely one of the main themes in his mystical political works. And of course, the concept of walayat too, the sanctified authority, as I mentioned.
Yes. Yeah, I'm glad you brought this up. So, I mean, in some ways very similar to kind of the metaphysical poets, that we have in English, bringing in all of these metaphysical themes in Neoplatonic frameworks. But it strikes me that Sana'i, with his critique of hypocrisy and hang out with these Sufis, he's not just enamored with this guy. He thinks this, whoever Bahram Shah, whoever this is, he thinks this guy is. It strikes me that there's something more going on here with the praise poetry. I mean, is he just trying to flex and show off his learning and his erudition? Is he trying to inspire something in the poet? Because it seems like what's going on here is more than mere flattery, like finding a way to make a toothless, lipless smile and connect that to metaphysical hierarchies and make it sound attractive. That seems like something more than just, you're really good, you can beat people in battles.
Right.
Give me gold.
Yeah, it's definitely beyond that. And it's also, these qasidas are not necessarily just praises. I think they're also a way for Sana'i to preach his model of kingship, right? This is the transcendent king that he cherishes, right? Surely he's saying that Bahram Shah is that. But at the same time, we could say that even if Bahram Shah is not that, by kind of bringing Bahram Shah up like that, he's kind of preaching his vision of an ideal ruler to him. So I think not only he's trying to show off his knowledge, his skills in poetry, his knowledge of metaphysics, he has like basically a political agenda that he's not only preaching through his ethical works, like the walled garden, the advice works, but also it shows in his panegyrics. So there is definitely things beyond that, right? But then at the same time, I think he's kind of playing a game, and this probably would be a good thing to discuss in the next question. But he's playing a game in the sense that he's legitimizing Bahram Shah, knowing that this would give him the podium to do his preaching, right? And so I think constantly he's very, very much aware of that tension, and he's saying that I'm doing this for a good cause. My cause is for the there's this verse when he says, I serve the azadegan, meaning the liberated ones. So I kind of sound like I'm praising this ruler, but this is all for a good cause, right? And so I think through this is just like, you can't just quite look at his panegyrics as praise works. That's true. That's right.
Yeah, something much more than flattery going on here. Oh, that's very interesting. Professor Boylston, anything you have to add to that on the panegyrics or on the other themes going throughout Sana'i's work?
Yeah, I think it's a really important point to note how different the context was, because for us, panegyrics just sit badly. We just, in our cultural context, praising people in that way just doesn't seem like a particularly authentic thing to do. But for Sana'i, he's also he makes it clear that he's also supporting the institution. So if you don't have a strong ruler, then in that context, there are marauding tribes around the borders who every century or so, they come in and decimate and slaughter. So the fact of having a strong ruler is what keeps people safe. And it's what allows religion and spirituality to be practiced. So it's very clear that he's affirming the ruler. He's giving a standard for the ruler to live up to, but he's also affirming the institution of the importance of kind of stable government, you might say, at the same time.
Strikes me, it's actually, these kind of panegyrics are kind of like the old TV show, the West Wing. Right. People have, like Martin Sheen, it's like, look, this is the ideal president who does all this stuff, and this is the kind of happy, idealized form of the way Washington politics works. And so the qasidas seem kind of like the West Wing kind of thing, and the ghazals are like a music video. They're kind of like a trippy music video, very, very affecting. So he has this theme of kind of metaphysical praise in support of power, but also at the same time trying to transform that power in particular ways through his verse. Professor Boylston, you also mentioned these kind of themes of bewilderment and union of opposites, and not necessarily universality, but multiple different perspectives. Can you say some more about that? And how is that strictly limited to his ghazals? Is that in his masnavis? Do you find that throughout all of his work?
I think you find it across all of his work. This is something I like to do, is you read the ghazals against the qasidas, and you read the qasidas against the masnavis, and they kind of unlock each other. Whereas usually people studying these things, they read ghazals as ghazals and that's it. But something to add here is he has a kind of approach which is like, I think of it like the theory of instantaneous enlightenment. In some of these lectures, he's telling people just wake up, just like leave your worldly ways and just get on the right track, just immediately. But he also has an approach which is more like gradual enlightenment. So he has some approaches where it's very much step by step. So one of his poems called the Sayr al-Ibad, which is the journey of the servants to the place of return, it starts with this praise of the wind, which is really beautiful. But then he takes the reader on this journey through the cosmos and through his own soul at the same time. And this becomes a really important theme in 12th century Persian poetry and beyond. The idea that through the imagination, you can journey through the levels of reality, the levels of the cosmos, going through the planetary spheres, but also you're going through the levels of, first of all, your own ego, and then, as Dr. Zahiremami said, then to the universal soul, and then to the universal intellect. And he wants to transcend that. And he's actually disagreeing with Avicenna here. So he knows about Avicenna's visionary journey, Hayy bin Yaqzan, where the universal intellect guides the wayfarer through this journey. It's a lot like Dante, and people have compared this to the Divine Comedy and even wondered about kind of influence. But for him, the intellect guide can get you up to a certain point, and then it can't take you any further. So to get you to pure unity, you need the patron, you need Muhammad ibn Mansur. So this turns out to be another poem for the same patron that I mentioned earlier, that you need this religious figure who is rooted in the Quran and the prophetic Sunnah to take you beyond the level of the philosophers in many ways, and take you beyond the level of the universal intellect into the divine presence. So it's an interesting way where these it's a masnavi, it's a narrative poem, but it's mirroring a lot of the themes we've talked about.
Wow, fantastic. Really sounds like there's quite a lot in Sana'i. I'm glad both of you are working on this to make it accessible to the rest of us. So now, if we have the time, I think let's turn to what Sana'i has to say about poetry itself. Clearly, he worked in prose in other genres at other times. I'm assuming when he was preaching, he didn't preach in verse the whole time. What does he have to say about poetry? Why did he choose poetry as a medium to do all these different things that he's trying to do?
So he actually does most of his preaching actually in poetry. What we have from him in prose, and it's kind of dubious whether it's really his writings, like we don't know how many of those are authentic, are his letters, right? But he thinks that poetry is the most effective tool for preaching. So first things first, he thinks that poetry in general, like the profane poetry and religion, don't go hand in hand. And he's very much aware of some of the debates of his time and earlier centuries about poetry. So there's a lot of debates about poetry that it's like some sort of a magic, right? Many of these poets and also literary critics of like the medieval period cite Quran chapter 2 verse 224, as for poets only the misguided follow them, right? So he's very much aware of the fact that him practicing poetry is kind of puts him in a weird position, right? But he justifies that by saying that his poetry is the poetry of religion and wisdom. And there's a lot of comparisons between him and Hassan ibn Thabit, the eulogist of Prophet Muhammad. So he very much says that, well, see, that eulogist was writing praise of Muhammad, and so I am doing the same thing, right? I'm producing religious poetry. But the thing with poetry is that poetry was the mode par excellence for communication with the elite. It's always kind of rated higher than prose. It's considered at the time that Sana'i was writing more complex form of communication. And so a number of Sana'i's patrons were, of course, members of the elite, including Bahram Shah, right? Or learned people, right? Like Muhammad ibn Mansur. So he's writing for these people in poetry. At the same time, poetry has rhyme and rhythm, as we know, and that makes poetry an easier tool for education. Why? Because people can memorize it. It's an aid for memorization, right? In fact, the word for poetry, verse, in Persian and Arabic is nazm, meaning order, and nathr, being prose, means to scatter, right? So something that's orderly is easier to be memorized, right? So, and as a preacher, as an educator, he's constantly aware of the fact that poetry could be like kind of more effective, right? But also, it's interesting that poetry would bring him kind of close to poets that were not necessarily preachers before him, like the Ferdowsi of Tus, who wrote Shahnameh. And so Shahnameh used to be constantly read in the court, and as a tool for educating the ruler. It was used as a mirror for princes. There was this office in court, the office of Shahnameh Khan, the reciter of the Shahnameh, who would come and read Shahnameh on a regular basis to the Ghaznavid rulers, right? And so he's trying to establish himself as some sort of an educator who has produced works that are worth reading for whomever want to be educated, right? And so again, he's trying to kind of elevate his status by writing poetry. But at the same time, in a way, he's innovative also in the sense that he brings a number of philosophical and scholarly debates of his time into poetry. Like he's engaging with New Platonism, he's engaging with the works of Shi'is, he's engaging with like Nasser Khosrow, Sajistani, all these Ismaili writers. He's citing brethren of purity. Like I have come across like passages in his poetry that are like verbatim, like brethren of purity. It's as if like he's taking that prose and it's like putting it into poetry, translating, versifying it basically, right? He's showing himself as being a scholar, but also a scholar poet, if that makes sense to you.
That's amazing. So it's really all of the learning, all of these parables, all of these different cultural and political things, he's synthesizing them into this poetic, easily memorizable, kind of pedagogic, but also very beautiful form.
But also very beautiful, yeah. I mean, his ghazals and panegyrics are full of intricate imagery, right?
Yeah, wonderful. Professor Boylston, do you have anything to add to that? What does Sana'i tell us about poetry and how it works and what it can do that other forms of language or even arts can't do?
Yeah, there's a really interesting section in the Hadiqat, the Walled Garden, that I've been thinking about a lot, where he defends the fact that he combines serious poetry with satire, Hazlan, Jad and Haz. And this was a question people would ask, and it becomes kind of a classic thing of defending the fact that you do this. But he's got a really amazing explanation for this, where he basically says the whole cosmos is based on duality. The heart beats with a duality. With different medicinal herbs, there are some that kind of speed things up, and there are some that slow things down. Even in the divine nature, there's wrath and there's kindness. So everything has this duality, and if you're a host, you need to be kind to all the guests. You need the lamb there, and then you need the greenery around it. You need to lay the table for the intellectuals, and you need to lay the table for the workers as well, so they can come and enjoy it. So he's really trying to bring everybody to the table, and poetry is the best way to do that, because it's a language that you can appreciate just the beauty of it, And you can memorize it even if you don't have a high level of education. Like in these sessions of sermonizing, everyone would be present. But also you can include these recondite allusions as well. And at the end of that passage, he says, within you there's a Jesus and there's a donkey. You have this higher spiritual self and you have this lower self, the nafs. And I'm going to speak to both of them. I'm going to give gold to the Jesus within you, and I'm going to give hay to the donkey within you. So I'm going to give you these really refined kind of philosophical points. And then he's also going to tell dirty stories as well. And he does have a few of those, the qabihat, these, really kind of lewd stories. And he basically says, look, if I'm telling you serious stuff, then really focus on it. And if I tell you in the form of a funny joke or a story, it's just going to stick to your soul, because that's how the nafs works. So there's a deep psychology to his use of poetry and his combination of all these different genres and all of these different intellectual discourses as well.
Oh, that's fantastic. That's absolutely fantastic. Yeah, there seems to be something. Poetry has this incredible synthetic quality of bringing together things that in other contexts would be opposites, but all of a sudden they become wonderful bedfellows in poetry. Well, you have to share some of those kabihat, those funny, dirty jokes, stories with us with us later. But so I think we'll wrap up now. And can you tell us a bit about Sana'i's legacy? We've heard a little bit about how he's influenced poets after him, but aside from you two academics, who's reading Sana'i today? Are people still reciting his poetry, still studying it? What's kind of his legacy and his contemporary, the life of his work today? Professor Zahiremami, we'll start with you.
Sure. So Sana'i is unfortunately very much overshadowed by Rumi. So you see, like if you're sitting in a mahfil, a gathering with a number of Persianate speakers, they would tend to quote Rumi more than Sana'i. But of course, Sana'i's legacy is pretty strong in the sense that he was widely quoted right after his death. Like he's the first manuscript of his wall garden, the oldest extant manuscript, belongs to 23 years after his death. It was commissioned in a court in Anatolia, so completely on the other side of the opposite side of the world. He was part of the literary canon 50 years after his death. And so throughout the medieval period and early modern period, authors quote him quite often. I'm mostly interested in his political legacy, and I see that he has opened a pathway for future mystical authors to write at courts and gain popularity in courts by kind of using the kind of rhetoric he uses for preaching. And I think that's one reason why during the Safavid period, one of the Persianate early modern dynasties, he becomes so big, and they commission a number of his works. But interestingly, I was reading some of Ayatollah Khomeini's speeches. I noticed that he quotes a number of mystics, including Ibn Arabi, in his speeches. And when he's talking about his vision of authority, right? And to this kind of mixture or intersection of politics and mysticism, in a way I can't quite say that Sana'i sets the trend, but Sana'i is part of that trend. And when he's writing, this trend has just started. And by bringing this trend into poetry, he's making it popular. So his legacy kind of lasts, and now we see that the use of mystical writings in the writings of, let's say, a Shiite cleric that then became the leader of a country in the course of the Islamic Revolution still is there. So I see his legacy more of an intellectual legacy, but we still consider him part of the canon. He's in school books. You can't, there's no high school graduate that doesn't know Sana'i. In of course, Persian literature curricula, always Sana'i is one of the poets that students study. But of course, as I mentioned, only a handful of scholars have paid attention to him. And I'm just very honored to be a guest in your podcast with Dr. Boylston, who's one of these handful of scholars. Unfortunately, we lost Professor Franklin Lewis and Professor De Bruyn, both of them Sana'i scholars this past year. And so I think there's more need there for more scholars to pay attention to him.
Absolutely. I certainly want to read more after our conversation today. Professor Boylston, can you tell us anything more, anything you want to add about Sana'i's legacy in contemporary life?
Yeah, to speak to that, I agree with everything there. It's really interesting. Sana'i's style, especially in these homiletics, as soon as you hear someone doing a parody of Sana'i, you know it's Sana'i. And there was a beautiful satire written when the transition of president went from Ahmadinejad to Hassan Rouhani. And Ahmadinejad had just fallen out of favor with the leaders and things like that. And it was a Tarji band, so it was there would be a poem and there would be a refrain. And the refrain was be careful, don't break their hearts, it's really dangerous, Hassan. So it's Ahmadinejad is the voice, the narrator of the poem, telling Hassan Rouhani to be really careful not to break people's hearts. But the poet used the style of Sana'i, and as soon as he started doing that, you know, okay, this is Sana'i. So when it's one of those classic styles, just like if someone is doing a takeoff and they sound like a Hafez, they sound like a Rumi. Sana'i has one of those voices that is really noticeable. Also, one thing I found interesting, I don't know if people remember the 2017 film by Guillermo del Toro, The Shape of Water.
Mm-hmm.
So that actually ends the last thing in that film. It's one of these, somebody took Sana'i and did their own like free translation of it, and then Del Toro did a free translation of it. But the poem ends with lines that are inspired at least by Sana'i, and it says, "Unable to perceive the shape of you, I find you all around me. Your presence fills my eyes with your love. It humbles my heart, for you are everywhere." So Sana'i is still with us in, much like this poem, it humbles our heart because Sana'i is everywhere.
Wow, I can't think of a better way to end. Thank you very much, Professor Zahiremami, Professor Boylston, for being with us. I hope you'll tune in next week to hear our next podcast episode. Thank you very much.